What's up, everybody? It's KBR Sports, the best sports talk show, your 24-hour day. Don't forget, you also follow and subscribe to the KBR Sports podcast by going on Rabble TV, Spreaker, YouTube, iTunes, and SoundCloud. And make sure you all subscribe also to each of those different mediums, so that way you'll be notified whenever the KBR Sports podcast is streaming live and whenever the KBR Sports podcast is posted. And so make sure you also don't forget to follow the KBR Sports Twitter page at KBR_sports, with the live links and show topics are tweeted prior to every single show. That way, if any of you ever struggle to find the show, you can just go to the Twitter page, and the live links and all the past show postings will be back up on there for you all to tune into. And don't forget that also you can comment, like, and also make sure you subscribe on each of those different mediums, so that way that your comments and your feedback can be followed and be talked about live during the show, and so we can also get a gauge of how you all feel about the different topics discussed on the show, so you guys can get your input in on whatever that may be getting discussed on the show. Alright, so before the break, I was alluding to a major powerhouse that got knocked off this past weekend in the college football atmosphere. That major powerhouse being the one and only Alabama Crimson Tide. Yes, Alabama Crimson Tide. A team that a lot of people naturally is always natural reaction to just always be like, oh, Alabama's number one. Alabama's going to go to the make the playoffs. Going to end up being in the last two. It always seems to be a predetermined fact until Auburn had something else to say about that, in which Auburn, who was sixth at the time of the matchup, ends up beating Alabama. And it's not one of those fluke wins where Alabama loses off like a last-minute kick, field goal, or something like that, and then it was returned back for a touchdown. But no, it was really like they got beat. Auburn ends up taking this one 26-14, in which they really had Alabama on the clamps for most of the game. I mean, Jalen Hurts couldn't really get anything going in the passing game, which a lot of people always alluded to, in the fact that is and what will be Alabama's Achilles heel. The fact that Jalen Hurts is not the quarterback that exactly ignites them in the passing game, and that his game has holes in it in terms of his overall passing ability. I mean, Jalen Hurts was he completed 13 of 23 passes for 177 yards and 1 touchdown. And when you're lacking that much in the passing game, a lot of times it becomes easier for teams to defend you, because you do become, to a degree, one-dimensional. And so teams end up focusing more on your rushing ability and putting a lot more resources towards your ability to run the football, and making it a staunch point to not allow you to be able to run the football. So when you look at it from that degree, you see how Auburn capitalized and made it a point to not let Alabama beat them on the ground, and then more so force Jalen Hurts to beat them. So when you look at how this game, one of the big things about this game, sorry, I had to get my words together, but one of the biggest things that comes out of this game is what everybody's gonna look at is the ramifications of this game. Because in the ramifications of this game, you have to sit back and think, how does this affect the college football rankings? How does this affect the CFP standings? Because now with this Alabama loss, in the most recent AP top 25, you see that Clemson is number 1, Oklahoma number 2, Wisconsin number 3. These are not the official rankings, just to mind you. These are not the official rankings, but the official rankings get announced every Tuesday night, so they'll be announced tomorrow night. And you best believe there will be reaction on the show come Wednesday to those rankings. So, and then Auburn being 4th, and Alabama now being 5, with Georgia right behind in 6th. But here's the thing, though: Alabama's done. Like, Alabama has nothing. Like, Alabama now has to have their faith in other teams. Like, Alabama their destiny is not in their own hands. So here's a lot of scenarios that can end up playing out in which Alabama does not make the CFP. If Clemson wins their game, if Oklahoma wins their game, if Wisconsin wins their game, if Auburn wins their game, then you have to sit back. Then that's essentially what will nullify. And Auburn and Georgia are playing in the championship, in the SEC championship. So, excuse me. So, when you look at those prospects, you got to sit back and think, okay, so in one instance, if Wisconsin beats Ohio State in their final game, that will leave them being a 13-0 team. And in that instance, you can't leave a undefeated Wisconsin team out with a marquee win over a team like Ohio State and such on their resume. Even though a lot of people will say, oh, a lot of people more so will kind of knock the conference, and from them coming from the Big Ten West and whatnot. Wisconsin is still, regardless of undefeated record, and they do have wins, like a win over Iowa. They have a win over Michigan. They do have the win. If they end up beating Ohio State, they will have a win over an Ohio State team that some people might. If Ohio State were to win in reverse instead of Wisconsin, some people might put Ohio State over Alabama as opposed to Alabama being asserted in there over Ohio State. Because when we think about what marquee win does Alabama have? Okay, like let's really think about it. Take a second and really take it in. Here's the thing. Alabama beat Florida when Florida State was number 3. Okay, then you keep going down the schedule. Alabama is really beating up on a lot of lesser opponents. You see, they had a close game against Texas A&M, but who's also not ranked and you see they beat Tennessee handedly. They beat LSU 19. I guess if you want to count Mississippi State, who's 16th, but other than that, Alabama doesn't really have any huge marquee wins. And this the Florida State one were supposed to be their marquee wins on the season, but it hasn't panned out to be that way. So when you sit back and think about it, you gotta really take into account, like, this could really be something that, like, Alabama could really off of or really be left out of the CFP because of their inability to show up against Auburn. Like, this Auburn win was supposed to, like, this was meant to be the win for Alabama. Like, this was supposed to be a game that Alabama needed in order to solidify their position. Like if they would have won this game, I mean, they would have made it into the CFP without a doubt. Like, there would have been no doubts. But now they need a lot of help, because now even when you look at the slate of games for Georgia beat a Notre Dame team at Notre Dame, and a Notre Dame team that being ranked themselves, they're a tough beat. Then they also beat Mississippi State. They also beat a lot of the same teams as Alabama, but then you also have their one loss at the hands of Auburn as well. So now if with those two teams in the SEC championship, if if Georgia ends up coming down and beating Auburn in the SEC championship, then that gives them that one win, that marquee win that puts them over Alabama. So in that case, you can make the case that they lose out in a scenario where if Georgia beats Auburn, that's the one scenario you can see them losing out in. But now a lot of it comes down to how people fare the win over Notre Dame versus the win over Florida State, because Notre Dame proved to be a tougher team and a way more tested team coming down the test of time as the season waned, more so than Florida State, who has just essentially unraveled altogether. But granted, they've had injuries, their quarterbacks got hurt and everything like that, but Florida State just essentially unraveled and was not the same team. But then you look at the scenario where you have Oklahoma and Clemson. I mean, those two teams are 11-1 as well. 11-1 as well. But if those guys will win their games, they're definitely going to have a seat at the top of the mountain in the college football playoff. And you also got to consider one thing as well. It's the precedent of putting two SEC teams into the college football playoff is one thing. I don't know if these guys want to do, that the decision makers really want to do in terms of grading who makes it into the college football playoffs. Like, two SEC teams in there with arguably other teams having tougher schedules. Like, Alabama's schedule wasn't the toughest one out there. You had teams like Oklahoma played a tougher schedule. Clemson did. Auburn did. And then you have Ohio State. In Ohio State, now that's where things get somewhat interesting, because then you look at the precedent that the committee set last year with how they handled the whole Penn State situation. So then when you look at Ohio State, Ohio State has 2 losses coming from the Big Ten East. Their one loss came to Oklahoma, who right now Oklahoma is sitting at one of the top 2 teams, or one of the top 5 teams, at least in the nation. Then their other loss came to an Iowa team that has beat on other people in this throughout this college football season as well. So the loss to Iowa it's not a good loss at all. The one to Oklahoma is definitely more withstanding. But the one to Iowa is definitely where you can see Ohio State being held back. But if they can beat the undefeated Wisconsin team, that can propel Ohio State with a tougher game schedule, and then you can get them that grade of having a more impressive slate of wins, because that's essentially what the committee a lot of times boils this down to. Who has a more impressive slate of wins? Anybody can set themselves up with a lot of easy games or a lot of winnable games, and then they come down the slate and they're undefeated. But when you have those Oklahomas, when you have those Ohio States, when you have those Clemsons, when you have those Auburns, when you have those Georgias, those Notre Dames, those Penn States, those LSUs in your way, and you have to beat those teams on your way to getting to the mountaintop, that a lot of times will a lot more brownie points in the eyes of the committee, because the committee realizes, hey, they challenge themselves, and due to challenging themselves, we realize that this team is one of the best teams in the playoffs, but they just happen to run into another great team that's most likely going to have a playoff spot too. And in that case, in Ohio State, that being Oklahoma. Now, the loss to Iowa is definitely what could definitely hold them back, because if they only if you nullify the loss to Iowa, you could definitely that Ohio State would definitely be higher up, because Ohio State would be up there with the rest of the crews, because Oklahoma in themselves is a tough powerhouse, reigning from the Big 12. So you gotta just sit there and take all these things into account, and you gotta just wonder how this Alabama loss, because man, it's just, and you definitely heard Nick Saban trying to make the case for this Alabama team, talking about how this team deserves to play in the CFP. You heard him, campaigning for his team, which any head coach is going to do. They campaign for their team and make the best case for they possibly can. But that loss definitely, man, it shoots Alabama, but it took their destiny out of their own hands. Is essentially what it did. Now, Miami losing to Pitt definitely helped Alabama a lot, because if Miami hadn't lost to Pitt, Miami was in the top, was in the last standings that were released. But Miami losing to Pitt essentially dropped them down heavily as well. And so a lot of what it comes down to now, this was sitting back, waiting, and hoping for, like, if Miami beats Clemson, if Miami can beat Clemson now, that will make things a lot really interesting in how this playoff pans out. If Miami can end up coming up on top of Clemson, and we'll definitely make Clemson a 2-loss team heading into college rankings. So we'll definitely have to see how everything plays out, because right now Alabama, their hands are tied. They got to sit back, watch, and do a lot of praying and hope that a lot of people they need to lose, because the one scenario where you definitely see Alabama making it in is if Wisconsin loses to Ohio State, if Georgia loses to Auburn, you could definitely see that being a possible scenario. It's one of the guys to sit back and think that they have to, if Oklahoma possibly loses, but I don't really see really Oklahoma losing, but Clemson has more of a challenging task in Miami rather than Oklahoma. So I would definitely want to see, this would be a very interesting of college ball, everybody. So I recommend everybody get themselves to a television set. Make sure they're tuned in, ready to watch, because it's definitely going to be a really interesting weekend of college ball. All right, y'all. That's going to be it for this segment. When I come back from the break, I'm going to be touching on an NBA player who took a break away from the game. And it's a guy that you would be surprised, and you would think that he wanted basketball in his hand possible if all he's went through over the past few years. Stay tuned to find out who I'm talking about. It's KBR Sports, the best sports show you 24 hour a day. Well, remember, when I come back, when I head to the break, the link will disappear. Refresh the page after a minute or two, probably about roughly 56 seconds. Probably that much time. And the live link will be back up for you all to tune into. It's all